Professor Landy is the author of Philosophy as Fiction, Self-Deception and Knowledge Improves, Oxford 2004, and of How to Do Things with Fictions, Oxford 2012, which is quite recent. He's also the co-editor of 2 volumes, Thematics, New Approaches, SUNY 1995, with Claude Brémond and Thomas Parel, and The Reenchantment of the World, Secular Magic in a Rational Age, Stanford 2009, with Michael Saller. Philosophy as Fiction deals with issues of self-knowledge and self-deception and self-fashioning in Proust, à la recherche du temps perdu, while raising the question of what literary form contributes to an engagement with such questions. How to Do Things with Fictions explores a series of texts by Plato, Beckett, Mallarmé, and Marx that function as training grounds for the mental capacities. Professor Landy has appeared on NPR shows and numerous other shows. And last but not least, Professor Landy has received the Walter G. Gorst Award for Teaching Excellence in 1999 and the Dean's Award for Distinguished Teaching in 2001. Then please help me welcome Professor Landy.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much to Maya, Pascal, and Nicola, and all the organizers for this wonderful conference. And I hope that my talk won't be too much of a whimper. It's a little deflationary, but it's not totally deflationary in the end. It's a semi-rousing finale, so maybe all is not lost. What can literature do in a crisis? This is a truly excellent question. It's a very important question, and it's an exceedingly complicated question. The answer may well depend on what kind of a crisis we're talking about, what kind of literature, at what time period, what kind of culture, and of course for whom, since literature presumably does different things for writers and for readers. Indeed, different things for different sorts of writers and readers. I don't plan to talk about all positions on this highly complicated grid. I'll talk mainly about what we can expect today as readers in Western democracies. I'll talk first about what we should hope for in a political crisis, and second about what we should hope for in a personal crisis. And what I want to propose is simply that we continue to hold out some expectations from literature, but we don't expect everything. I realize that this goes against the spirit of much of literary studies, which is most comfortable when operating in one of 2 modes, utopian and apocalyptic. We're used to hearing, for example, that literature cannot possibly help in a political crisis since it itself is part of the problem, perhaps indeed the most important part of the problem. That it operates willy-nilly as the vehicle for dominant ideology, distracts and pacifies the populace, making them feel good about the crisis, the way the legs of those tiller girls, according to Siegfried Krakauer, made everyone feel good about Fordism and Taylorism in the factories. Or it turns all of us into snobs, setting up a space that's kept off limits to a class of people that's perpetually held at the door. It is, in short, a very bad thing. The standard alternative to this is that literature is going to save the world. If you find yourself faced with a crisis, this view suggests the best possible solution is to stick a novel on it. That novel will tell everyone how to behave, they will listen, or will make them feel all gooey inside, and be nice, or it will unsettle their categories, and they will be liberated since all categories are oppressive. Literature will do all this, and once about it, will body forth a utopia of happy communal life. It is, in short, a very good thing. As you can gather, I'm a little suspicious of both extremes. Krakauer's piece, titled appropriately enough, Girls in a Crisis, is a brilliant essay. But is it really true that we'll go home from a Tiller Girls show and conclude, even unconsciously, that factory work is A-OK? Isn't it possible for a single individual to find the spectacle of choreography impressive and the spectacle of factory work disgusting? Hidden inside Krakauer's prose is an argument by analogy. Choreography involves coordinated body movements, and conveyor belts involve coordinated body movements. Therefore, choreography is a conveyor belt, and every time we think of one, we'd automatically think of the other. This is a bit like D.A. Miller's claim that the panopticon involves knowing what everyone is up to, and omniscient narration also involves knowing what everyone is up to, and that means that it follows as night the day that omniscient narrations, quote, systematically participate in a general economy of policing power, unquote. On that basis, I could probably convince you of all kinds of things, such as, for example, that the chiasmus is a Christian motif. It would be kind of fun, but I'm not going to get carried away. Arguments by analogy are often a bit slippery. Just because a pair of objects are alike in some way, it doesn't follow that they are similar in all the ways that count. So I rather suspect that at the end of the day, the Krakauer view is just a little paranoid, as are the D.A. Miller view, the Altus view, and the Bourdieu view. At the same time, however, I also suspect that at the end of the day, the Nussbaum view, and the Schopenhauer view, and the Adorno view are just a little utopia. Is literature really going to make us into paragons of goodness? Is literature really the best thing to turn to in a political crisis? I passionately want to believe Adorno when he tells us in that devastatingly French style of his that total purposelessness gives the lie to totality of purposefulness in the world of domination. And only by virtue of this negation has existing society up to now become aware of another that is possible. I want to believe that people look at artworks, see Kantian purposelessness, and form a desire to extend this non-utilitarian way of doing business to society at large. But once again, we are in the realm of extrapolation on the basis of analogy. And it's not clear that the extrapolation is a realistic one. I mean, consider the way people think about going to Las Vegas. It's great for a day, maybe 2, but no offense, I hope to anybody, we don't all want to live there. I know people who live there, so I guess some people want to live there. Just so, literature may well be a sacred space, safe from the incursions of purposefulness. But do most people conclude from this that we can and should export that situation to everyday life? Do we want our professional lives, for example, to be purposeless? Elaine Scarry's view is, as I see it, similarly optimistic. According to Scarry, justice involves symmetry, and beauty involves symmetry. And so, you'll recognize the form of the argument, the sight of beauty automatically predisposes people to seek justice. Now, not everyone would agree that beauty always and only involves symmetry. But the bigger problem is that the sight of beauty does not, in real life, prompt even-handed behavior. Sadly, the truth is the reverse. Studies repeatedly show that men and women considered attractive do better in life than men and women not considered attractive. They are, according to some studies, twice as likely to get hired, twice as likely not to get fired, and liable to earn 10 to 15% more than everyone else. I find claims like Scarry's and Adorno's to be among the most tempting that there are, since they take seriously the value of literary reform. Still, the idea that literary reform is a political utopia, waiting to be projected onto the world, and that automatically generates a desire for that to happen, strikes me as a little bit wishful. Now, some of you may well be thinking, that's all well and good, but what about Uncle Tom's Cabin? Surely Uncle Tom's Cabin had a very real and positive effect on the world. That's true. Unlike Scarry and Adorno, Harriet Beecher Stowe took a more direct approach to addressing the political crisis. And that more direct approach met with considerable success. I think, however, that we should be wary of turning the Uncle Tom's Cabin case into the model of how literature is written and read. First of all, great literature needs to outlive its occasion in a way that Uncle Tom's Cabin notoriously has not. Second, the effects of literary texts are unreliable. Even Uncle Tom's Cabin, this is not usually talked about, even Uncle Tom's Cabin yielded mixed results, with readers in the South stiffening their resistance to abolition. So in the North, it had the effect that we all know, very positively. In the South, it had actually made things even worse, if that's possible. Readers in the South stiffening their resistance to abolition, and indeed producing their own novels in reaction, one of which was adapted into the most successful piece of racist cinema of all time. More on that in a minute. Successful, as I see, in scare quotes. Third, given how many books the average American reads these days, in many cases a grand total of 0 per year, we probably shouldn't count on literature to save the world. Above all, though, the problem with using Uncle Tom's Cabin as our paradigm is that it would come down to turning literature into propaganda and readers into sponges. While the short-term gains are extremely attractive, they are, I think, ultimately outweighed by the long-term costs. What do I mean by the gains being outweighed by the costs? Well, consider that great counterpart to Uncle Tom's Cabin, Birth of a Nation. Great in scare quotes, too. In conversations about the social function of literature, you very often hear people talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin, but you don't hear them talking nearly as much about Birth of a Nation, that infamous film in which the hero is the Ku Klux Klan. Now, you might think, no problem, nobody watches movies like that, but you'll be wrong. Birth of a Nation was a huge smash. It made $18 million, about $200 million in today's money, a record that took over 20 years to be broken. Another fun fact. In 1998, Modern Library decided to create a list of the 100 best modern novels written in English. But since this is the age of Web 2.0, They also poll their readers. The official list starts with Ulysses and The Great Gatsby. By the way, Great Gatsby, are you kidding me? But anyway, that's guess who tops the readers list? Anyone have a guess? That is correct. That is correct. It's not James Joyce, it's not Toni Morrison, it's not Joseph Conrad, it is Ayn Rand. In fact, Ayn Rand represents 4 of the top 10 novels on the readers list. And guess who counts for an additional 3 of the top 10? L. Ron Hubbard. This brings me to the central point I want to make about literature and politics. And that point is this: be careful what you wish for. The idea that works of fiction shape readers' attitudes sounds really good as long as we're thinking about Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it really does sound extremely good. But once we start encouraging people to go to novels for advice on how to live, we're opening the door to all kinds of unfortunate consequences. They might read The Fountainhead and come away thinking that everyone on welfare should be left to starve. They might watch the TV show 24 and conclude that torture is a great idea. They might watch Edward Albee's play The Goat and decide, as someone I know did, that bestiality is not so bad after all. They might read Lolita, this is an even worse, more horrifying case, and decide, as someone else I know did, that pedophilia is not so bad after all. It's really happened to someone of my acquaintance, I would not say friend. These are surely catastrophic results, but they are, notice, the direct consequence of a well-intentioned idea. The problem with using fiction to remedy social ills is that fictions do not, in the usual case, give people good reasons to adopt new beliefs. Actually, Uncle Tom's Cabin is an interesting counter case, because a year after it was published, Stowe came out with a key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, in which she actually set forth the facts that she was basing the novel on. So it's actually a complicated case, in which, at least after the publication of the second book, people did have reason. But in the general case, novels themselves do not give people reasons to adopt new beliefs. They merely play on our emotions. Now, getting someone to change their beliefs on the basis of emotions is a process that has a variety of names. When I do it, it's called persuasion. When you do it, it's called rhetoric. And when they do it, it's called propaganda. Even if we leave aside the question of whether it's okay to brainwash people into doing the right thing, and even if we leave aside the question of whether we want great literature to be in the brainwashing business, I think we can all agree that propaganda is a two-edged sword. Anyone can use it, not just those on the side of the angels. For every Uncle Tom's Cabin, there's a Birth of the Nation. For every Bleak House, there's an Atlas Shrugged. For every Color Purple, there's a Turner Diaries, that white supremacist novel Timothy McVeigh left in his trunk on the way to bombing the Oklahoma building. Every single one of these fictions plays on its readers' empathy. Not just high-minded writers like Dickens, who invite us to sympathize with Little Dorrit, but also writers of Westerns, who present poor, helpless colonizers attacked by awful, violent Native Americans, Ayn Rand, whose resplendent job creators are constantly being bothered by those pesky spongers who merely do the real work, and so on and so on. As we saw, the sad fact is that people are reading books like Atlas Shrugged in great numbers, or at least great numbers relative to everything else. By contrast, not many people are reading the kinds of books we like, such as Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon. I'm just going to assume, for the purposes of argument, that we in this room prefer Song of Solomon to Atlas Shrugged. Correct me if I'm wrong in question. And of those who do read books like Song of Solomon, the vast majority already hold the moral positions that you would want them to hold. If they didn't, they would probably never have picked up the book in the first place. At least in the moral sense, but only in the moral sense. Though most of those who read Morrison simply do not need her. Again, only in the moral sense. Only in the moral sense. They need her for all kinds of work. So I say this, rather than encouraging people to go to the movies for their moral edification, it would be much wiser to train them to be cautious. The vast majority of what they're going to watch and read will cause moral devastation if used as a model. Think of all the heroes we've been excitedly following over the last 10 years or so: Dexter Morgan, Tony Soprano, Omar Little, my personal favorite, Frank Underwood, Nurse Jackie, Nucky Thompson, Walter White, maybe favorite equal. It's an avalanche of anti-heroes. Martha Nussbaum says that we should simply make sure nobody watches any of this stuff. But is that a world we want to live in? Furthermore, it's not clear that these TV shows are the only thing that would go. Dickens, that favorite darling of ethical critics, notoriously goes in for anti-Semitic stereotypes. Balzac does the same. Ralph Ellison, another incredible writer, seems to think women unfit to govern. In Jane Eyre, as Catherine Belsey points out, a woman of African heritage is compared to a wild animal. So we're going to have to ban Charlotte Bronte too. Now, I'm not defending any of the above things. I'm just saying a lot of stuff's going to go if essentially what we're doing when we tell people about how they're supposed to read fiction is learn important moral lessons from these books. Model yourself on these characters and so on. Now you might want to say that such unfortunate elements are without danger, since readers are smart enough to know which beliefs to adopt and which to leave alone. But if readers already knew that, they wouldn't need moral improvement. If the idea is that readers do need moral improvement, and that they get them from reading fictions, we're going to have to start by banning 90% of the books, including the very best among them. The good news is that there are other ways to change people's minds. We can, for example, use the truth. I know that's very old-fashioned, but consider Al Gore's documentary about climate change and Inconvenient Truth. This film did a huge amount for the environmental cause, all without making up a single lovable character or a single line of witty repartee. Or again, consider Food, Inc., The Omnivore's Dilemma, and Jonathan Safran Foer's Eating Animals. There haven't been that many meat industry-themed best-selling fictions in the past 50 years or so, but that hasn't stopped us as a nation from moving gradually towards more enlightened attitudes. And we heard actually, so in a conversation yesterday with Professor Suzuki, she pointed out that Christine de Pizan actually switched, even in her career, from writing poetry to writing in non-fictional genres. And maybe even she was starting to get the sense that there were other ways of doing things. But we'd have to ask her whether that's the case. There's nothing wrong with using the truth, whether in the form of documentaries like the ones I mentioned, or in the form of testimonial writings like Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz, or Frederick Douglass's autobiography. You don't have to trick people into thinking slavery was a terrible thing. Slavery genuinely was a terrible thing. Let the truth do its work. And if people aren't yet capable of discerning truth from lies, help them. Cultivate their ability to separate the good from bad arguments. That, and not propaganda, is the real purpose of education. Was that too strong? I apologize. Should we turn to literature then in a moral crisis? Should be clear by now, I'm not convinced that we should. Granted, it's not bad for remedying our short attention spans. So that's the crisis we have in mind, maybe. It's not bad for cultivating a love for leisure activities that put minimal stress on the environment. Not bad. And it's not bad for helping us to occupy a variety of points of view, which is surely a good thing when we come to bring our positions into the public sphere. But one thing it isn't, I think, is a reliable cultivator of moral virtue. To see this, all you have to do is attend a faculty meeting in a literature department. Present company accepted, of course. We're a bunch of raging narcissist divas who love nothing more than to throw our toys at the pram, as they say in my home country. And look at me making that catchy remark. All that time reading and rereading Austen, Proust, and Morrison, and I'm still a bit of a jerk. This is surely not a good sign for moralist people. And I'm not even the worst offender. History has offered examples of people even more unpleasant than me who would be big fans of fiction. Plutarch reports a tyrant, Alexander Phareus, weeping at the fate of Hecuba and Andromache and the Trojan women, then going back the next day to dressing people up as bears and having them ripped apart by dogs. Similarly, the Nazis famously wept while watching Antigone in Paris, then went back to their business the next day. Rebels loved Shakespeare and Dostoevsky. Himmler, this is the part that stuns me the most, was a big fan of Siddhartha, Hesse's novel about Buddhism. As Suzanne Keen has pointed out, the most horrific genocides in history coincided with the highest literacy rates the world has ever seen. The best we can say about literature is that its effects are not reliable. As they say in the medical profession, results may vary. So moral improvement through literature doesn't happen as often as we sometimes like to think. And even when it does, that's not necessarily a good thing in the long run, since it means that the benefited party is susceptible to propaganda. She could easily be corrupted by Atlas Shrugged or 24 or even Jane Eyre. If we don't want to censor more or less everything, including the best stuff we have, we'd probably do better to tell people to change their reading strategy. When it comes to personal crises, so now this is the part where it becomes more optimistic. When it comes to personal crises, however, the picture changes considerably. In the final year of his life, Richard Rorty published an extraordinary article in Poetry magazine. People here read this? He'd recently been diagnosed with inoperable pancreatic cancer and had found none of the philosophy he knew, and he had read a lot of philosophy, to be of any help to him, not even the being unto death of his beloved writing. The only thing that was making a difference was, he suddenly realized, lyric poetry. Poetry comforted Richard Rorty, and let me emphasize this, it did not do so because of some quote-unquote message that it bore within itself. There is nothing about death, wrote Rorty, that Swinburne and Landor knew, but Epicurus and Heidegger failed to grasp. Instead, it comforted Rorty by means of its effect on his emotions, and it achieved that emotional effect by means of its form. It was Rorty again. I found comfort in those slow meanders and those stuttering ends. I suspect that no comparable effect could have been produced by prose. Not just imagery, but also rhyme and rhythm were needed to do the job. In lines such as these, all three conspire to produce a degree of compression, thus of impact, that only verse can achieve. The same was true, I think, for a good friend of mine that I lost earlier this year, an extraordinary soul who died of lung cancer at the age of 37, having never smoked a cigarette in his life. Unlike Rorty, my friend Paul believed in God, but as he once told me, he didn't find that a source of comfort, surprisingly, in his days of sickness. To his own surprise, what came into his mind and eased his mental anguish was not the Bible, but Beckett. I remember the moment when my overwhelming uneasiness yielded, he wrote in a much cited op-ed piece. 7 words from Samuel Beckett began to repeat in my head. The seemingly impassable sea of uncertainty parted. I can't go on, I'll go on. I took a step forward, repeating the phrase over and over, I can't go on, I'll go on, and then, at some point, I was through. I fervently hope that none of us has to face the kind of crisis that Paul did, or that Richard Rorty did. But if we do, I suspect we may find literary writers to be one of the greatest sources of assistance. Additional friends around the bedside, as Rorty more or less described his favorite poets. This may sound tacky, but if it does, I think the fault for that lies with us, not with poetry or with Rorty or Paul. Poetry can be and can do all kinds of things. But one of the things it does particularly well, tacky or not, is to hit us with an emotional wallop. If you want to feel better about believing this, you can call it affect theory. I won't mind, just as long as you don't also think human beings are automata, or that cognition plays no part in most of our emotional states. Under those conditions, have affect. Poetry zeroes in on our affective mechanisms, which is why it's so great in a personal crisis, which is why, in turn, it continues to matter, even in an age of declining readership. The great aesthetic theorist Kendall Walton recently compared certain poets to speechwriters, deliberate or inadvertent speechwriters. A speechwriter, Walton points out, generates words for another person to use, as though they were her own. What counts is not whether the speechwriter believes those words herself. What counts is that they serve the needs of the politician she's working with. Just so, Walton argues, certain poets in certain parts of their poems offer us sequences of words for our use, words we can borrow for our circumstances when situations arrive in our lives. Poems can work this way even when the poet is capturing an emotional experience she herself is not feeling. Consider pop songs, which are rarely written by people in the immediate throes of love at first sight. Walton calls this thought writing, by analogy with speech writing. I prefer to call it mood writing. What poets really offer us is words we can use like spells to conjure ourselves into or out of powerful emotional states. We conjure ourselves out of emotional states when, faced with a personal crisis, we wish to feel a little bit less. We want to reduce the torment of unleashed emotion, lessen the scale of the crashing waves, regain a degree of control, return to a place from which we may make decisions for the future and re-engage with the world. At such times, poetry of various kinds may serve as devices for what today's psychologists call reframing. As Richard Lazarus showed empirically, what you feel depends on what you believe. The way you think about an experience changes, to some degree, the quality and intensity of your emotional reaction. Relatedly, although a bit more frivolously, studies have recently shown that wine tastes more delicious when it's expensive, and that prunes sell better when they're called dried plums. It's only about 10%, but that's still significant, given it's the same thing. Now, it turns out that one particularly powerful resource for reframing is metaphor. In Toni Morrison's Beloved, a stranger named Amy does Setha the magnificent favor of comparing the scars on her back, scars she has received from whipping, to the branches of a tree. It's a tree, Lou, a choke cherry tree. See, here's the trunk. It's red and split wide open, full of sap. And this here is the parting for the branches. Your back got a whole tree on it. From then on, Setha sees it that way too. And this reframing is the source of a great deal of psychological comfort. The very same motif returns almost verbatim in The Brief, Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz, where the gangster describes the burn scars on Bailey's back as a cyclone. He didn't care about the burn scars on her back. It looks like the painting of a cyclone, and that's what you are. Tormenta in the madrugada, with my accent. Another important resource for reframing is narrative form. The significance of an event depends in part on its place in the narrative. Think of characters whose death is a release, characters whose death is heroic, characters whose death is romantic, as opposed to characters whose death is a waste, a shock, an inexplicable surge. Literary fictions provide us with a stock of narrative shapes, shapes whose contours allow us at least to embrace the unbearable. Metaphor and narrative shape assist us then in feeling less. But there are also times when what we want is to feel not less, but more, to dig deep into our emotion, to dwell within it, to drain it to its dregs. I don't read Philip Larkin's Ode in order to overcome or reframe my fear of death. I read it to feel that fear more intensely. And the reason it works is, this time, not because of narrativity, and not primarily because of metaphor, but above all because of rhythm. It's those three final sentences, each brutally short, coldly tolling us towards the earth. The sky is white as clay with no sun. Work has to be done. Postmen, like doctors, go from house to house. It's those cruel rhymes, emblems of the world going about its business without us, of the poem refusing to get upset just because we are. Just so, when I'm feeling useless and here in my head, quick now, here now, always, ridiculous, the waste, sad time, stretching before and after, I sense the sluggishness imposed by the three stressed syllables in a row. Waste, sad time. The stretching of the enjambment of the following line, jarring contrast after a line for a comment. On occasions like those, Larkin and Eliot are acting as mood writers. Again, whether deliberately or inadvertently. Their brilliant use of rhythm and rhyme is helping me to feel more intensely what I already feel. As at the symphony and in the movies, so too in poetry, music is a powerful generator of emotion. And that emotion is often what we want, something we intuit to be a good and important component of a fully human mind. We could, of course, just anesthetize ourselves, but we don't. We don't want to, because authenticity is a value. To be who you are is not just to know what you know. It's also to feel what you feel. In a personal crisis, literature serves as our bedside friend by helping us to inhabit our experience, to achieve fully humanity, to be who we are. Let me acknowledge right away that this is a very old idea. Wordsworth proposed it, together with some very compelling reasons, in the first years of the 19th century, and he, of course, had his own precursors. Let me be clear also that it's not the only thing that literature can do. I have droned on endlessly elsewhere about its host of other benefits, including clarification, formal modeling, defamiliarization, transfiguration of suffering, and the cultivation of mental capacities. In their different ways, great works of literature do one or more of these things for us. And having them around in a crisis, or having done prior to falling into a crisis the work of clarification and cultivation, could be extraordinarily beneficial. And the benefits come, so it seems to me, with absolutely no costs attached. So it seems to me that this is not a bad compromise. While deploying literature in a socio-political crisis may be problematic, turning to poetry in a personal plight is a wonderful thing to be able to do. And yet, we're still not quite out of the woods, and I still have about 10 minutes. Problem number one. None of this will happen unless people actually actually read the poetry in the first place. Yes, I know that Americans today are doing an awful lot of reading, possibly more than any previous generation, but they are not reading more poetry. They are not reading more Shakespeare, and they are not reading more Toni Morrison. In 2005, 2/3 of college freshmen said they read little or nothing for pleasure. In 2002, more than half of the adult population in the United States, those were surveyed, read no work of literature whatsoever that whole year. Almost half didn't read a book of any kind, me included. Meanwhile, the number of children who never or hardly ever read for pleasure has tripled since the 1980s. Problem 2. Apparently, what I was saying a moment ago about poetry has become a deeply shameful thing to say. A few years ago, I went to Chicago and gave a talk about literary works that fine-tune our mental capacities. An extremely distinguished literature scholar, who will go unnamed here, said something really striking to me. We're friends, and I think he meant it as in good spirit, let's just say. But what he said was this: your work is interesting, a bit vulgar, but interesting. My work, I learned, is vulgar. It's in bad taste these days to talk about literature actually being good for something. I've since heard similar things elsewhere. People who ascribe benefits to literature are being accused of adopting a crass or blasphemous attitude towards novels and poems and plays. Now, I have to say I find this a little confusing. I don't hear those same people calling Nietzsche vulgar. Nietzsche, the guy who said art is valuable because it can turn our fits of nausea into imaginations with which it's possible to live, because it gives us a good conscience about deceiving ourselves, because it's the only superior counterforce to all will to denial of life. I don't hear them calling Wordsworth vulgar. Wordsworth, the guy who said poetry is valuable because it pulls us, as he said, out of our state of almost savage torpor. I don't hear them calling Kafka vulgar. Kafka, the guy who said, a book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. I also don't hear them attaching the label of vulgarity to Proust, who famously celebrated the unique capacity of aesthetic style to body forth the perspective of other individuals. I don't hear them attaching it to Shklovsky, who thought defamiliarization was a marvelous and important gift, or Tolstoy, who saw the ability to overcome isolation as the great attractive force of art, or Aristotle, who believed that the essence of a thing is its telos, and the telos of tragedy is its purification of fear, pity, and related emotions. These guys aren't parading Heidegger. They're not chiding Schopenhauer. They aren't chastising Kundera. Just when did it become vulgar to think of artworks contributing in an important and specifiable way to our ordinary lives? I've been trying to figure out just what people like my distinguished friend have against the idea. Some of them, I suspect, simply believe that it's not true, and that artworks offer nothing more than what they like to call a refined pleasure. As an esteemed colleague of mine at Stanford once said, also nameless, some people like skiing, other people like wine. I happen to like reading novels. This simply cannot be true. Surely we cannot deny that those poems really did provide comfort to Richard Rorty in his darkest hour. It would be a bit ridiculous to insist that all he got was refined pleasure. Similarly, readers of Kundera's novels really do come away, or many of them, most of them probably, really do come away having thought hard about memory, desire, and politics. It would be a bit odd to insist that all the rumination could never possibly have any consequences on their later real-life attitudes. Other opponents will presumably say that it's just wrong, almost morally wrong, to go to artworks in search of any kind of benefit. These folks seem to think that there's no way to receive the benefit from a work of art without turning that benefit into a use. In other words, without brutally instrumentalizing the artwork, violently wresting it away from its essence and coercing it to our shallow purposes, strip mining it for its use value, and then throwing it away. Is this really true, however? Imagine it's your birthday, and your friend, good friend, bakes you a beautiful cake. It's so beautiful that you feel reluctant to cut into it. But, you know, you're not a crazy person, and so you do cut the cake, and you do share it, and you do eat it. And you have committed no offense, either against your friend or against the cake. It's what your friend wanted. In the same way, Kundera wants us to think hard when we read his novels. He says this over and over again in his essays. He's essentially a Bartinian. Toni Morrison agrees too. Quote, I don't want to give my readers something to swallow. I want to give them something to feel and think about. Unquote. So, if we read Song of Solomon and think about it, I really don't think we're being callous. Morrison wants us to think hard. Similarly, Wordsworth wants us to be moved by his poems. Kafka wants his writing to be an axe to the frozen sea within us. Tragedians want us to weep. Comedians want us to laugh. Yes, literary works are intrinsically valuable, as virtuos or testaments to human possibility. I'll grant it. But they also make possible certain kinds of experience. And they're valuable in part because of the experiences they make possible. So let's not be churlish and refuse to open our presents just because the wrapping paper is so nice. All of this is to say that I can't personally, maybe people will prove me wrong in the question period, I can't see anything morally wrong in accepting the gifts being offered us by great writers, any more than I think there's anything morally wrong in accepting the gifts offered to us by our friends. Nor, by the way, I think there's anything wrong in talking about those gifts, or trying to think what those gifts consist in, how great they are. There's no exploitation at work here in either case. And I don't think refined pleasure is nearly good enough for capturing the range of likely reactions to poems and stories and plays. We're left, I think, with one last possibility, that is to say, one last argument that the vulgarity brigade could bring to bear on vulgar people like me. And that is the magic pill objection. The objection goes like this. Pick a benefit you think is conferred by artworks. Now imagine there's a magic pill that confers the same benefit. For example, a magic pill that would have allowed Richard Rorty to come to terms with his disease. In a world in which the magic pill existed, would we ditch the poetry? Clearly not. So, the argument goes, it seems as though the poetry must have some vague value that cannot be captured in any of its uses. This is a powerful argument, but let's face it, there is no such pill. We do have anti-anxiety medications, but we do not, as far as I know, have reframing medications. So for now, at least, we may as well keep taking the poetry. Take 2 sonnets and call me in the morning. And some of the other things literature can do, such as giving us practice in simultaneously believing and disbelieving one and the same thing, the kind of practice Nietzsche has in mind, are, I suspect, entirely impossible to achieve by any non-literary means. What is more, and this is a crucial point made by Tamar Gendler about a wide variety of science fiction-style thought experiments, if such a pill ever comes into existence, we will surely all be living very different lives. Maybe we'll be immortal. Maybe our minds will have merged with computers. Maybe we'll be able to clone ourselves. Who knows how we'll answer the question then, or what kind of creatures we will have become. These thought experiments aren't always the most reliable guide to what our intuitions would actually be. So I find it perfectly reasonable to say that great artworks outstrip all their benefits. Fair enough. But even if that's the case, those benefits are surely still real. And those benefits are surely still at least a part of our reason for spending time with them. It remains perfectly fine to avail ourselves of those benefits, even as we continue to worship the objects for yielding all of them and more. One final point about vulgarity. Frankly, I wish more of us were guilty of it. As I mentioned a moment ago, people just aren't reading the books we care about anymore. I don't think the refined pleasure argument is going to win too many converts. I don't think I need to tell you guys the following things, but they're my talks, I'm going to say. I don't think the refined pleasure argument is going to win too many converts. Oh, I imagine someone saying, reading is like skiing? Thanks very much. I think I'll stick to my slaloms. If we give people no reason to read Toni Morrison rather than reading Stephanie Meyer, or indeed reading nothing at all, I don't see why we should expect anything to change. Literature is great in a crisis, a personal one at least. But literature won't be good in any crisis if nobody's reading. Literature cannot help us in our crises while it's in a crisis of its own. You can't be benefited by what you don't use. So we have to stop telling people literature is in league with tyranny, that evil omniscient narrator, those horrible choreographed legs. We have to stop telling people literature is merely a ticket to snobbery. We have to stop telling people literature is completely useless. Thank you, Stanley Fish. And we even have to stop telling people that literature is a universal panacea, it's a solution to all of the world's problems. We need to give people not just a reason to read, but a reason they can believe. So I want to leave you with this exhortation. I told you there would be a semi-rousing. My exhortation is, let's be effing vulgar. I don't mean that we should pretend literature can solve all the world's problems. Melting hearts on contact, filling people with a desire for symmetry in the legal system, and magically secreting utopian truth. I mean that we should honestly say what it can do, cultivating our mental capacities, providing models for the shape of a life, revealing us to ourselves, raising difficult questions, sharpening our critical faculties, transfiguring suffering, helping us to feel less, helping us to feel more. Our expectations may be slight, but they're nonetheless real, or at least they will be real if people continue reading. While literature is in a crisis, we all need to be vulgar so it can continue to deliver on the slight expectations it genuinely has. Thank you. Questions or reputations?
I want to know the name of this person.
Yeah, you do. Yeah, but I'm being filmed. So,
Probably, yes.
maybe later.
Hi there. I walked in a little bit late, so maybe I missed something.
You missed the ranting part.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds like it was probably the best part. But I was wondering if a lot of what you were saying made me think of Rita Felsky and her uses of literature and some of the newer stuff that she's doing, which is to look beyond the new historicist imperative for ideology critique without suddenly becoming uncritical. She talks about a new phenomenology of reading and tries to find, I guess, an aesthetics that's constructive in some ways, and develops some categories that actually I heard you were talking about enchantment and knowledge, I think. And she has some other categories as well. So I was wondering, I mean, this is all new terrain for me, but, and so I couldn't really ascertain how what you're saying would be positioned next to what she's saying, but I'm curious, would you want to position what you're saying next to what she's saying? Would you want to distinguish what you're saying from what she's saying? What do you think of what she's doing?
Yeah, I mean, we're very much in agreement on the question of enchantment. There was sort of a wave, people writing about chunks, people like Jane Bennett, for example, and then the book that I mentioned that I co-edited, and some other things, a bunch of things, and Rita Felsky enters into that general wave, I think. Maybe towards the tail end, I don't see that much at the moment, but certainly, we're absolutely eye to eye on that. Where I think we differ, I think she's a little bit more sanguine about knowledge. That's one of our primary categories. I think we need to be very wary of encouraging people to think that they are learning facts when they are reading fictions. If you're lucky, the thing that you think you took away, right? So unfortunately, in our culture, people are encouraged from a very, very early age to do that and nothing else. This is, I think, a disaster. Imagine if you learned all the things you know from fiction. Somebody did a study of the percentage of marriages in 19th century novels that end in divorce compared to the percentage of marriages in actual France that end in divorce in the 19th century. It's something like 20% to 4%. That's a very tame example, but there's plenty of things we wouldn't want to take away. And I think we're cheery about it because we say to ourselves, well, surely someone isn't going to walk away from, they're going to walk away from Lolita having extracted the right things from it and not the wrong things. But part of my rant included mention of somebody I know who read Lolita and having been properly trained in our education system to learn the message and empathize with the protagonist, decided that pedophilia isn't so bad after all. So I'm much less sanguine than Rita Felsen on the question of knowledge. I think what we get at best from fiction when it comes to factual information or something like that is something at the status of gossip. We damn well better verify that. Because, you know, writers of fictions are, and rightly, under no constraint to be true to the actual reality of the world. This is how it is and how it should be, otherwise the institution of fiction wouldn't exist. Given that, we really shouldn't be encouraging people to go to fictions for their beliefs about the world. So we're, I think, very much on the same page when it comes to enchantment and not when it comes to knowledge. Other questions?
Can you talk a little bit more about critical practice in the academia and how you see it figuring? Because like you say that it's okay to talk about what novels are doing or what literature is doing, but there's something I almost don't fully trust you when you say that. So
wait, sorry. What did I say?
Just that you said it's okay that the practice of being an academic and sort of getting to the bottom of what these works are doing.
Right. Right.
You say that's okay to do.
Right.
But I was wondering if you could just elaborate.
Yeah, I mean, what I meant is that there's nothing morally wrong with it.
Yeah.
So that, yeah, obviously different senses of okay.
I suppose it's usefulness. It's usefulness.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Are we actually doing it?
Are we doing
Yeah.
it?
I think yes. So, I mean, you know, I think it's tempting to think that the only way we could do anything meaningful is if we changed the world politically, and that's a high aspiration. And I'm not in any way trying to suggest that we shouldn't try to change the world politically. I just don't think the best way for us to do that is through our teaching. I mean, it's complicated because, of course, very often literary texts are used as kind of pretexts to introduce a whole variety of facts. And at which point, if you're actually introducing facts into the conversation, well, then in fact the learning is taking place. But it's not taking place through the fiction. So it's a little bit complicated. But the simple version of what I want to say is, you know, even if we take the Weber position that it's not really our job as educators to tell people what they should think politically, we can still be doing something really important if we enrich people's inner lives. And there's lots and lots of ways that literary text can do that with our help. The with our help part is also not, you know, we need another half an hour for that. But the idea is supposed to be, I think, that you can't just, you know, you can't just airdrop copies of, you know, Mount Bovary into some area you think people are really having a bad time. So there's, you know, it's complicated because in a sense these works are doing it themselves, but in another sense they're only doing it themselves on people whose capacities to read are being trained in a certain kind of way. Just as, you know, in whatever, any given aesthetic genre you could mention, hip-hop, opera, if you don't have a certain kind of proficiency in it, you're not going to appreciate the most interesting moves. So it is the artworks themselves that are doing the work, but they're not going to be able to do the work unless people have, you know, been shown the various great ways that they go about reading. Because, you know, today they're just told, find the message and talk about metaphors. That's what they get, you know, in their high school education, with some exceptions. I think that's most of what they get. So that's why I think it's not only okay, but actually good that we still exist. And I hope we continue to. Please don't have a lot of times. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this idea of being vulgar. It seemed almost to me like you were using vulgar in a kind of very classical sense of the word, in terms of popular, of easily understood, especially the way you kind of introduce this is you're talking with your elite friend at the University of Chicago or wherever, and it says those kind of vulgar thing. You look careful, right? And
Not that vulgar.
It sounds like you do a lot of kind of speaking in sense of literature, not just in closed rooms and academics and hotels, but out kind of in that public eye and sort of trying to embrace this popular sense of vulgarity.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be dogmatic about it. I don't think everyone, we all sort of different and contribute or thrive and so on in different ways. So my claim isn't, when I say we should all be vulgar, I don't mean necessarily we should all be writing in a certain kind of way or speaking in certain venues or what have you. I just mean we should be willing to embarrass ourselves saying that poetry is a movement. That's all I mean, right? And if we believe it, if you don't believe it, okay. But if you believe it, but you just feel, I can't afford to say it. I can't bring myself to say it. I'm going to look stupid saying it. That's why I'm being vulgar. It doesn't exclude the possibility that some of us, try to reach broader audience. I think that's okay too.
Is there also in there maybe a bit of a critique of overall academic language? I guess I don't know. So we should speak this like this, instead of couching it all within, if we're able to make a speech act and this and the other thing, as opposed to, well, this moves its spirit.
I guess, again, I don't want to be dogmatic. I think there are cases where it's difficult to get it right without using highfalutin language. Kant's a good example. So I want to be totally dogmatic about it. But I guess I do think, if you're trying to get people to fall in love with poetry, and if your experience is anything like mine, it's not always easy, then it may be the best thing to try to be as clear as possible. But again, that's not, I don't want to be dogmatic and say, well, everyone should always write in the same kind of way or something. I'm deeply irritated with it a lot of the time, but that doesn't mean there can't be a place for it sometimes. I just think, when it comes to, as it were, the front line, when it comes to us in whatever, not necessarily, some kind of invited talk, but just on the street or with one's family, whatever, when the question comes up, why are you doing this? I think it's really good if we have a story, and a story that people can understand. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. It was really enlightening and moving. I was just wondering why poetry? And this is a question I always ask myself too, and I can never put my finger on it. And you talked about people like Eliot and Wordsworth and Larkin, but what about contemporary poetry? What about, right, so you talked about that essay, that wordy essay, right, where rhythm, rhyme, and images moved him in some way. And what about poetry that doesn't necessarily use that? What about a lot of contemporary poetry that still moves you in some way? So I'm trying to put my finger on what it is about poetry, and maybe this poetry that doesn't use these things also carries some kind of historical echo of these things. So why poetry?
Yeah, that's a fantastic, huge question. Yeah, so just for the record, I'm talking about anything you could imagine, comic books, novels, films, and so Charlie Morrison is a key example, and so on and so on. So I want to be a pluralist about genre and also about effect. There's, how many I live, 7 or 8, or God knows, a dozen, 1,000 things that these words can do. Narrowing it down to the poetry question, I do think, first of all, we have to be a pluralist there too. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the only thing that poetry can or should do is to move us or to reframe. So those are kind of two things. They can do all kinds of other things too. I think Shakespeare's Sonnet 35, for example, is a formal model of aesthetic self-actioning, but that would be a whole different conversation. What about contemporary poetry? Well, yes, I do tend to think, well, first of all, there probably isn't any poetry without any rhythm. Right? So it may not have a regular rhythm or a traditional rhythm or something like that. Secondly, I agree with you. I think a lot of it's going to have echoes in the historical past. I cut a piece in here about, I've heard the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think that they will sing to me, where you get that iambic pentameter suddenly falling in great height. It has this extraordinary sound.
But Proof is a formalized poem as well, right?
But there's no... In some places, yes. But not there, right? So there's sometimes rhyme, and there's sometimes a recognizable rhythm, and oftentimes it's just blank verse. So I think you're probably going to find that this kind of modern / contemporary poetry is going to carry some echoes. but it's also going to be doing things rhythmically that just may not be the evolved things. But probably if they're moving us in some kind of way, they're moving us by means of their musicality, whatever that turns out to be.
Like, tell me what poetry is.
Tell you what poetry is? Yeah, that's a dangerous question. I don't know if you can answer it with regret. I don't know. I mean, a lot of these genre categories are a little bit artificial. Boundaries are always very porous. So I prefer minimalist definitions that I keep. There's a lot of white space because this breaks the middle line. So yeah, I don't have a kind of metaphysical definition. I'm not sure there really could be one. But it's probably good enough for our purposes that poetry is what our culture takes to be poetry. As I was saying, for my purposes, the only thing I need is that there be a kind of separate space of writing, which is essentially a non-truth-based space of writing, if you like, right? So the criteria of excellence don't have anything to do with accuracy. And that's going to include, what we call poetry and what we call epic poetry, and what we call lyric poetry, epic poetry, it's going to include film, it's going to include drama, that's just say some film, etc., etc. I need that distinction, but I don't so much need to worry, thankfully, these much more difficult distinctions between genres. Yeah.
I have a question. Well, first of all, thank you for your work. I thought it was beautiful.
Thank you.
And I'm almost embarrassed at how pragmatic my question is.
Be vulgar.
So the question is, you talk a lot about the difference between fact and fiction and steering people towards truth and analysis. And I could hear that argument echoed in public education,
Yes.
where people argue that there should be much less fiction in the classroom, particularly in Common Core, and that we should do nonfiction.
Yes.
So I'm curious, how do you respond to that?
I do have views about that. Surprise, surprise. Yeah. Great point. I was reading a thing recently. Of course, this is confirmation bias, but we all notice the things that seem to confirm what we believe. It was a blog post, but it kind of gained a lot of traction. It was getting going viral, getting forwarded a lot. By somebody who was basically saying, look, the Common Core is a really great thing. I don't know why these people are complaining that we're reading less fiction. What do you do with fiction? Well, you sit there and you try to work out what these opaque, obscure, ambiguous symbols are supposed to represent. And then you come away with the message. Well, why don't we just go directly to nonfiction, where you get it more readily, and there's no ambiguity. And I think, yes, totally right, 100% right. This is the reductio of the message-based approach. I mean, if you believe that the point of reading works of literature is to learn about life, right, is to extract messages, then it's a highly inefficient way of doing it. Right? David Shield wrote a book called Reality Hunger. Anybody come across this one? Yeah. And he says, incredibly, why would anyone read Tolstoy anymore? Why would you read 700 pages just to get to the handful of insights for whose sake the novel was written? Right. If that's why Tolstoy wrote his novel, absolutely, let's not read Tolstoy. So that's one of the reasons I'm such a crusader against the message-based way of thinking about literature. It's absolutely true. If that's what it was, right? If the only point of reading literature were to extract messages, then the Common Core would be the right solution. In fact, we should ditch literature altogether, perhaps. But certainly, yeah, cut it down. Let's just go cut out the middleman. Let's go straight to the message. It's much more reliable because authors of nonfictions, of course, authors of nonfictions can lie, but they're held to the standards. If you can be sued if you lie about certain things. You can't be sued for lying in a fiction, right? So you get to the message more readily. It's more reliable, and you can still sharpen your critical faculties and so on. But it's not about that. And so that's my beef with the comment. But I don't think people have necessarily done enough to push back in this kind of way. And to say, hey guys, no, this actually wasn't why we thought everyone should be reading Toni Morrison. I mean, Toni Morrison, you know, I love her. I mean, obviously I love her novels, but also her interviews are kind of masterpieces in their own right. And she keeps saying over and over again, very patient to these interviewers, please don't look for messages. I don't want to talk to the people that I like and tell them, here's a message, and hand them these things with messages written on them. I can't remember the exact line. But certainly, you know, the line I quoted, I don't want to give people things to swallow. I want to give them things to feel and think about. But, you know, it's very, very hard to get people to hear that. That's why she has to keep saying it over and over again, very patiently, to many different interviews. So that's the problem with Common Core. I mean, it's completely logical. Starting from the premise that literature is all about messages, it reaches the absolutely logical conclusion that we can do without it. So we can do better.
Well, it's hard to answer the questions because they are all difficult questions. Then,
I noticed. I mean, I was asked to define poetry.
I know.
No.
No. Of course, what you are suggesting finally is to go back to a certain idea of the reader that we can obviously teach to be or teach our students to become. And along those lines, I'm thinking maybe we are in need of some revolutions such as the Mallarméenne revolution that is totally in rupture with this mimetic use of fiction. And finally, the result of a certain idea of realism that takes us from fiction to reading fiction as documentary. And in this same line of thought, I'm so upset with people in sociology, in social sciences, using sometimes fiction
Right.
without really thinking that there are fictions and you cannot use them as if they were a reflection of reality if you don't teach people to read fiction.
Yeah. I mean, you think about the amour courtois saying it.
Yeah.
Right? Everyone was saying, wow, I guess that must have happened.
Exactly, yes.
So yeah, I mean, I think historians are getting more sophisticated these days, but I totally take your point. What do we need? Yeah, again, I don't want to be too dogmatic, and I don't want to say, for example, that we should stop teaching Balzac or something like that.
Of course not.
But you're right that if we could also be teaching other things, and I don't know what it would look like exactly, but you know, maybe to start from things that are obviously, I mean, that's I guess something I do in my own teaching. I try to bring in objects that I think I could sell. Right? I think I can get people to love them. We're just meeting. I thought you deeply disagree with me. Silly, that's so vulgar. And B, that seem pretty clearly not to be message-based. So it's not that anything not only right away, but it might be, you know, it might be some film that is sort of readily enjoyable, but you know, I think I can pretty easily get people to acknowledge that it's not based around that. And then you can come back to Balzac and read him in a different way.
Exactly. Can I jump
Yes,
in
please.
again? Yeah, I was, with the conversation we had this morning, telling me that there is a genealogy of criticism that we need to have in mind in order to be able to read Mallarmé or to watch Heineke's movies without watching them as just a mirror of the reality or just as message-based representation. That's what I can very well hear in what you're saying is the fact that if we lose this tradition of criticism and knowledge of criticism, we will not be able to do anything else with this fiction than reading them as mirrors of the reality without any way to escape from it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, and there's going to be exactly a whole bunch of artworks. I just don't know what to do with it.
Exactly.
I mean, I remember when The White Ribbon came out, And everyone's saying it's really great. Why is it really great? Because it explains Nazism. I still can't get over that. So he made up a story about a little village. And even if that story had been true, it'd still only be one incident in one village in Germany. But it wasn't a real story. And how on earth is this supposed to explain? Don't get me started. So yeah, this is the world we're living in, where we don't really know what to do as authors. I mean, you're right, we need to keep that tradition of criticism from in mind.
Yeah, I'm just wondering in terms of some of these questions too, the role of kind of fiction in particular in terms of building empathy. There's a lot of studies about the fact that people who read fictional narratives are in general more empathetic. And I was just thinking about that in terms of even if you drawing the wrong message about Lolita, nonetheless there is a role of building a sense of being able to empathize with anybody, people who you would not necessarily normally be able to empathize with. That seems to be another important role. And in that too, I was thinking, I spent many years teaching high school, so the kind of the fact of the Common Core, which is very much about taking away fictional narratives, this privileging of informational text, even the idea of being able to relate. So the idea that David Coleman, the architect of the Common Core, who part of his argument is also against personal narratives, right? The idea that you're never going to have a job where somebody says, hey, write me a story about your summer. Is what he says. Nobody really cares about what you think and feel on a job. And that sense of like the content becomes also very like, what can you use on your job and whose stories get told. And so that seems to me to be connected to a sense of like, well, what role does literature and their fiction particularly play in the ability to both empathize and also imagine other possibilities, right. Even if there's sometimes a difficult line between how do you imagine and empathize without taking it as reality. But
right. Yeah, this is a great question. The jury's actually more out than it might seem. Okay. The Kid Castano study that you mentioned establishes a correlation between fiction reading and theory of mind, which isn't the same as empathy, but it is the same as what you were saying a moment ago, being able to imagine your way to another experience. So what the jury's out about is whether this translates into empathy. And it might turn out that it does, but it's not clear yet. And there are reasons to worry, like the Lolita case. Right? So one worry is indiscriminate empathy is also a problem. Another reason to worry is that our empathy tends to be directed towards the in-group. So Suzanne Keen, you guys know Suzanne Keen's book, Empathy, the Novel? Right, so you guys will remember this, this line where she talks about teaching a novel from Haiti, and she asked her students what the result was on them, and they said they called their mother. So they read this novel, and it awoke something in them, and their response was to channel the empathy into the in-group. So that's another place. The jury's still out on whether it's actually going to succeed in, because of course empathy is vital, but the real tough problem is getting that empathy to cross the border between the group that's taken to be us and the group that's taken to be not us. So yeah, and another way to worry about it is to think about psychopaths, or lesser, semi-psychopaths, whatever, borderline types where increasing theory of mind is actually very, I don't want to use the word beneficial, that sounds like the wrong thing, but it's sort of conducive to the purposes of torturers and sadists and people who just want to get ahead by all means and don't worry who they tread on. So Machiavellian intelligence you could think of as essentially morally neutral, right? It's the skill that permits you to read off from a social situation what people are thinking and how people interact and things like that. And you can use that for good. Sorry, it is the skill that's cultivated by reading, which Lisa Sunshine brilliantly use. Whether that is reliably is going to lead to the right kind of outcome or not is still an open question. So I think it's a sort of promising line, and it is something that we could say back to the Common Core, but only if it turns out to be true.
One
point you cited Nietzsche.
Yes.
You said, when reading, you want us to believe in disbelief. Disbelief, right?
Yep.
So how is that possible
Good point.
when you're reading a novel
Yeah.
without missing the moral lesson or the message that is being, sent across?
So, I refute the premise about there being lessons and stuff, but okay, but let's take the, how is it possible?
If there's any, if there's any.
If there's any, right. The idea behind Nietzsche's view on art is not that great artworks have some kind of message or lesson or moral instruction. That's not at all what they're good for. What they're good for is putting us in a very special state of mind, which is a divided state of mind. It has nothing to do with what we're told. Kendall Walton gives the example of somebody who goes to see some part of green slime, right? And the green slime seems to be coming towards you. And you start sweating, and maybe you grip the arms of your chair, maybe you even scream or something, but you do not leave the theater, and you do not call your family to warn them, right? So you're in a very interesting, odd state. Do you believe it's coming or not? Well, yes and no, right? Part of you, and that's because of course our minds are sort of modular, right? I mean, we can multi-process, we can multitask. So there's a part of you, so to speak, that takes what you're seeing to be real, and there's a part of you that knows that it's not, and that's the part that says, "Stay in your chair. It's all right. It's just a movie. Don't call your friends." And when that breaks down, then you see people accosting actors on stage. And they climb on the stage and say, "Unhand that woman," as somebody famously said to Othello in some production. But this is not how we're supposed to behave. And so Nietzsche's right. Nietzsche's right that fictions, not poems, but fictions, place us pretty reliably in this divided state, the state of dual consciousness, where we part believe and part disbelieve at one and the same time. What's the upshot of this? It's not that we learn something about the world. It's that we're able to cope with circumstances in which we need to believe what we know to be false. That's what it's for. And I think it's an amazingly powerful view, and he thinks that this is essentially, only as an aesthetic phenomenon is the world justified. So he thinks it's actually, again, seems like it shouldn't be vulgar, but he says that. But he thinks it's the great glory, it's the great glory of art. And in fact, that art is the great glory of beings. Maybe that's overblown, but it's surely an extraordinary benefit to be able to summon your aid in time of need. So that's the Nietzschean view. No more questions. Thank you all very much.